Hello, everyone. My name is Lori Nicholson, and I am the president and founder of Bark to Be Heard, which is a pet owners group. I look out for the voices of pet owners. I've invited a very special guest here today from the University of Liverpool, and you're probably wondering why a Brantford citizen like myself would take the time to do that, and how to get involved with this. Well, this dog behind me, Mr. Beebs, many years ago, 13 years ago, he got what's called a multi-drug resistant infection. And it was so bad that nobody really knew how to treat it. And sadly, I was forced to drive down to the University of Georgia to an infection specialist. And the thing that got me is the man said to me, this Dr. Stephen Budsberg, that, damn, I wish I had seen him 6 months ago. And that really resonated with me because this dog really suffered, and it caused the amputation of his leg. And I thought, first of all, why in the 21st century why do I have to drive to Georgia? And secondly, in the age of communication technology, why weren't the veterinarians able to speak to Stephen Budsberg themselves? Why is it that I was actually alerted to this man's specialty through a bunch of dog owners on a Yahoo group? And I thought, this isn't right. I mean, this is the 21st century, and why aren't they speaking? Why aren't they sharing? It just didn't seem like we were doing the best job we could. So fast forward, I ended up taking a ride to the CDC in Atlanta, and I met some folks there, and I asked them, and they said there's no such thing as nobody's collecting data on companion animals. And I was stunned. So then I actually talked to another epidemiologist who was at the University of Purdue University. And she said to me, Lori, we can't do anything with data because we don't have infrastructure. And I was like, what do you mean there's no infrastructure? She said, it's like a highway. We have no roads. We have no way for people to communicate between practices. And I was totally blown away by this. She said, what you really need is infrastructure. So I was like, okay. So 13 years have gone by, and this past October in 2018, I took a trip over to Liverpool, where they were celebrating 10 years of a small animal veterinary surveillance network, which I was like totally blown away by this thing. I sat in their computer lab, and I had 4 million records at my fingertips. And I looked up mast cell tumors at the time because my dog here in town has them. And I thought, I can't believe the power in this. I can't believe the healing in this. And why in the United States don't we have this? So I invited Professor Alan Radford to come here and tell us, how did they do this? And God willing, we'll be the first statewide Connecticut vet pet net, so that we could take all this fabulous data and finally do some good with it, sharing it, enable the skill sets of our veterinarians, but even more importantly, for academics and for research going forward. So for the first time, I have this picture here. It says it's about time we connect the dots. This is our practices, not just in Connecticut, but the entire country. It's all siloed. Nobody speaks, nobody shares. And yet there's a big picture. There's a lot to be learned. There's a great deal of power and healing that can come from connecting those dots in a network. So I think it is time we connect the dots. I think it's time that we actually take a look at the big picture for the very first time, and we make Connecticut the place to start it. And with that being said, I would like to introduce Professor Alan Radford.
Okay, thanks very much, Laurie, for your passion and the invite to come to beautiful, snowy Brantford. It's my first time in Brantford, not my first time in Connecticut. I did come to Connecticut when I was a student. I went dragging for ticks for Lyme disease and found some. So it's nice to be back. It's much colder than when I was last here. Anyway, what I'm going to do is share with you over the next 20 minutes or so some of our experiences in the UK about trying to, as Laurie said, trying to connect the dots between veterinary practitioners in the UK. So in order to do that, perhaps a little bit of an introduction to companion animals in the UK. You know this flag, I guess, and you probably recognise the 2 pictures here. The one at the top left is 10 Downing Street, and you'll see 10 Downing Street has its own cat, and the two people at the bottom, well, there's three people there. Two of them are very famous. I wonder which is the most famous one in the UK, in the US. Is it James Bond or the Queen? I'm not sure, but you know the Queen has her corgis too. So we love our companion animals in the UK. What about here? Well, you're kind of the same, really, aren't you? There's no political statements here, but your previous president had a White House dog, which we heard lots about in the UK media too. Your Disney is, has a strong tradition of celebrating the joy of pet ownership. One of my favourite films when I was growing up was 101 Dalmatians. And even just looking in the local media this morning, you see some, really nice examples of people celebrating the joys of companion animal ownership. The dog that is a video was actually a dog that was reunited after 2 years with its owner after being lost. But also, talking about the sad parts of companion animal ownership when it sometimes goes wrong. So companion animals are a big part of life in the States too. These are some figures from the UK, but I suspect you could broadly translate them up to the US as well. There are in the UK about 10 million cats and 10 million dogs. Around about a quarter to a third of households own one of those species. And the last bullet point's really aimed at those people who don't own a dog or a cat and perhaps feel less invested in them as species. But even if people don't own those animals, they still contact them regularly. 50% of people that don't own a dog contact a dog at least once a week. And as a result of that contact, there's now a huge amount of positive impact that companion animals have on humans, and also some downsides. And I've grabbed some images here from the internet just to show some of those interactions. I'm not going to go through them one at a time. Some of them are very positive, some of them are perhaps a bit more negative, some of them are quite negative. I guess we'd probably agree on most of them, maybe some of them we would disagree. The couple of slides at the bottom with the animals that have been cooked and shot are there really just to make the point that what we call companion animals in the UK, it's not necessarily the same as in every country. So we keep guinea pigs as companion animals, but in some countries they're eaten. And the rabbit is a very important pet animal species in the UK, but in some countries they're shot for sport and as a way of pest control. Okay, but despite the importance of them, there is an almost complete absence of pet health data, of population level pet health data in the UK, and that's been the situation for a long, long time. We have population level data on pretty much everything from human health to cattle and sheep health, even tree health. Tree health is surveyed at a national level in the UK, but companion animals, there is nothing. And I think that's pretty much the same in most countries across the world, including in the States. So why is that? It's kind of interesting to try and ponder why that might be. Well, where does the pressure for surveillance come from in terms of animal diseases? The pressure actually comes from the World Trade Organization. And in Europe, that feeds through the OIE, ultimately to the UK government, and it makes the UK have to legally survey for diseases in these species. You'll see that the dog and the cat are completely absent. And that, I think, is because when the World Trade Organization was set up, trade drove it, and the only species that were traded were food animals. Companion animals in the 1940s were a relatively rare luxury, and they certainly weren't traded to the same extent they are now. So as a result, global and national surveillance is largely for food animal species, and governments have no or very little responsibility to survey companion animal disease. And as a result, there is no population level data. There are a few examples, things like rabies, obviously very, very important disease where surveillance does occur, but that's very much the tip of the iceberg of companion animal disease. So how have we gone about trying to solve that? Well, we've used the growth of the computer. The little graph at the top left here shows the exponential growth in PC ownership. And with that came the demise of the paper health record, which was replaced by an electronic health record, or EHR. And we all have them as members of the human population. Our health record is now digitised, and the same is true for companion animals. I would say most veterinary practitioners now in the UK, and I'm sure in the US, have digital health records. And once they're digitised, well, then you can share them, you can move them around, you can use them in big scale if you can get hold of them. And that's what we're doing. It now has a scientific name. It's called health informatics. Health informatics has been defined as harnessing and reusing electronic health records for research and surveillance, and that's what we're trying to do with SAVSNet, the Small Animal Veterinary Surveillance Network. There is a challenge with health informatics. There are no national infrastructures for sharing data. There probably are more so for human health, but for veterinary health, that's not the case. And as a result, data is very much fragmented between private practitioners, in commercial diagnostic laboratories, and also fragmented in different pieces of software. There are also no standard procedures for recording data, which makes analysing the data a little bit harder. But I'll come to that in a moment. However, if we can collect the data, there is a truly great prize. The data is real time. It's temporally and spatially rich, which means we can learn a lot about the effect of climate on disease, for example, and we can learn whether diseases are more common in particular parts of the country. It's very flexible. It can be used to look at all sorts of diseases, whatever takes a companion animal to see their veterinary practitioner. It's a very efficient way of doing science. We can put together a national, in the UK, we've put together a national surveillance network in a very cost-efficient way, I think. Yes, we're interested in animal health, but it also has a lot to say about human health through things like zoonotic disease. They're diseases that pass directly between humans and animals and back the other way. One of the areas we're particularly interested in is antimicrobial resistance. And I think the data also has a lot to say about the positive side of animal ownership, which is companionship. So what do we do? In the UK, we collect data from two places. The top left from diagnostic laboratories, and down in the bottom left from vets in veterinary practice. And you'll see in both of those pictures, surrounded by the little red circles, there are what now look like slightly aged computer monitors, but they make the point that both in labs and practice, health records are now digitised. And we receive those data at Liverpool now in a scale which we perhaps never quite imagined was possible. We get about 10,000 records a day from diagnostic laboratories, about 6,000 records a day from vets in practice. Our database now has, well, somewhere north of 5 million consultation records from vets in practice, and probably over 100 million diagnostic results from laboratories. What do? We bring that data to the University of Liverpool, where we map it and we make it research ready. What we mean by that is, well, I can perhaps illustrate with a fairly trivial example. Some vets will write in their health record dog, and some will write canine. And we need to tell our computer that dog and canine are the same thing. We call that mapping. So we need to do that a lot to make the data research ready, but once it's done, then we have this large data resource. We can add to it things like climate data and deprivation scores, and then we use that for research, for surveillance, for our website, where people can go and see real-time statistics on disease and benchmarking, whereby we can feed back information to the practitioners that sent it to us in real time, so they can learn about the diseases in their own local area, as a reward, if you like, for trusting us with their data in the first place. So that's roughly what we do. I'll just take you through a couple of examples of how we've used the data from both laboratories and vets in practice. So data from labs. The sort of information we ask from a laboratory is shown here on the left, but the most important things really are the species and the breed, the vet's postcode, so we know roughly where the animal lived, just roughly where the animal lived, and the results of the test. And we've now get data from, we probably think about 70 or 80% of the vets in the UK, excuse me, can send us their diagnostic data through these laboratories. And there's some very big names, some of which you will not recognise in the US, but some of them you will too, because they're here as well. So you can now go to our website, and I've got a screenshot of our website here, but through the drop-down menus you can choose a pathogen, and then you can see the geographical distribution of the diagnosis of that pathogen, and also its temporal pattern. So you can see whether it's becoming more commonly diagnosed or whether it's seasonal, for example. And we never used to be able to do that before. I mean, I think it's exactly the sort of thing Laurie talked about at the beginning. These kind of data were not available to practitioners previously, but now, because they're sharing data, because we're starting to join the dots, if you like, we're now starting to see this kind of national picture of disease, which is exciting. This is an example on looking at antimicrobial resistance, and gives you a little bit of an idea of the scale of the data we're collecting. This is old, we now have a lot more data than this, but it still makes the point. For Salmonella, we've got the results for 16,000 animals here, 101 dogs, some 14 cats, and we can see the resistance pattern for these isolates as diagnosed by the laboratory. I'll just take one example here. We can plot the resistant, where the resistant bacteria have come from. Again, we never could do that before, so what we might want to do, for example, is look in these hotspots and say, what's going on here? Is there truly perhaps a resistant superbug in that area that needs some particular intervention? This is an example of a pretty typical health record that we might collect. It shows the range of data that is present in a health record. We collect the owner's postcode, or zip code as you would call it here, and I've blocked out various bits because obviously that's confidential. We collect information on the species of the animal, the breed, the sex, all the kind of obvious things that you'd expect a vet to record. We also collect the free text that the vet's written, and that's very complex data to analyse, but I'll give you some really nice examples of how we're now even able to extract information from that in pretty much real time, which is proving very exciting. And we collect the treatment data as well. The picture on the right shows you the UK, and each dot shows you where we're currently collecting, roughly where we're collecting data from. And we think we collect data from about 15% of the vets in the UK. I'm often asked, how many vets do you want to collect data from? 15% is enough. We have a lot of data, but we would like more practitioners to take part. That's something we're working on at the moment. So I'll just give you a few examples of how we use that kind of data, and I just remind you of the point that you can point this data at pretty much whatever disease you're interested in. I'm an infectious disease researcher by training, interested in viruses and vaccination. So we were keen to look at how vaccines were being used in practice. We know how they're supposed to be used, at least how vets are recommended to use them, but we didn't actually know how they were being used. So here we're seeing in dogs, at the top, cats at the bottom. This is the date in weeks, or the age of the animal in weeks when it's being vaccinated. And the peak is very much at 12 weeks, around about 12 weeks of age. There are a lot of guidelines around now that suggest animals should be vaccinated for longer. I don't want to say here whether I think that's a good thing or a bad thing. What we can say from the data is that vets in general are not vaccinating later than 12 weeks. Let's have a look at the free text. This obviously is complex. It's full of abbreviations and local spelling variations, lots of spelling mistakes, complete lack of punctuation, but a lot of medically useful information. And we've been using text mining to try and pull out important messages from it. I'll just show you one example here, which we're very excited about, which is looking at ticks. So this is an animal that a vet saw with diarrhea. That's what the D stands for. We won't worry too much about the rest of the text, but the vets happen to note at the end here that this animal, it's just hidden behind my picture, but this animal had a tick on it, and the vet's written down that they removed the tick from the ear. So we wondered whether we could actually identify those animals with ticks on in real time, and we can. So we can now plot the temporal distribution of ticks in the UK. There is a spring peak, which we knew about, but what we didn't know about was that the peak is very different in cats and dogs. The blue line is the dog and the orangey line is the cat. Cats, the tick activity peaks earlier, and they also have this curious secondary peak in the late autumn. And we think that's to do with the type of ticks that cats get compared to dogs. Cats like hedgehogs in the UK, and the common tick on a cat is the hedgehog tick, whereas on dogs it's the sheep tick. But it's really nice to see that coming out of the data. We can look at as well as that, we can also look at the geographical distribution. Ticks in the UK are not uniformly distributed. And here you can see for each of the seasons a sort of an index of tick activity. And this data is really useful not just for pet owners who might take their dogs for a walk in these areas, but remember these ticks also bite people. They can transmit disease to people. So we're hoping that this data will also be useful to public health officials and members of the public who are using these areas for recreation and work. So that's a nice example of tick activity. I'll finish with treatment. And probably the area we're working hardest on at the moment is around antibiotic use and antibiotic resistance. So we can use this data to look at what antibiotics vets are using. And here I'll show you some work that was sponsored by the Veterinary Medicines Directorate in the UK, done by this chap here called David Singleton. And it gives you a flavour of the scale of the data. You know, this is using data from almost 500,000 dogs and 200,000 cats. We have a lot more data than that now, but it still gives you an idea of the scale. Each of these dots is a practice. Each of these dots is one of our practices, and it shows their antibiotic use in cats and in dogs. So what we can see is some vets use a lot of antibiotics, some vets don't use very much. We're not trying to say these are wrong and these are right, but we think it's really important that these practices know who they are and where they are. So we now can write to these practitioners, each one of these practitioners, and say, this is you, this is you. And they can use that to help inform their prescribing practice. This is looking at antibiotic use over time, and we can see in the UK, over the 2 years of this study, antibiotic use was falling in dogs and cats, and that's generally considered to be a good thing. What about the types of antibiotics? Again, this is too busy, but each of the dots is a different practice. This is their antibiotic use in dogs and cats on the right, and these are all the different types of antibiotics that vets can use. In dogs, the most common type is potentiated amoxicillin. In cats, At this time point, and in the UK, it was a third generation cephalosporin, which some people would have an opinion about. Just to finish off, one of the things we do slightly differently is we also ask the practitioner to add a tiny piece of extra information to the health record that's not routinely recorded. And we do it through this little window that opens at the end of the consultation. The practitioner has to make this window disappear, they have to click on one of these buttons. What is the main reason for this visit? Gastroenteric signs, respiratory disease, pruritus, tumour, trauma. It's unwell, but none of the others. Vaccination, it's healthy, but not a vaccination. A post-op check, and this is where, this grey bar here is where vets can opt owners out. It's really important that owners don't have to take part in this, and if the owner says, I don't want to take part, then the vet just has to click on that grey button and we don't get their data. So all of these records, all 5 million of the records that we now have, has a, we call it a main presenting complaint added to it in real time, and that means we can drill down in much more detail. So this is just an example going back to the antibiotics, and I'm not going to go through this in any great detail, but now we can look at the use of all the different antibiotic types in each of the main presenting complaints. The pattern of antibiotic use is very different in each of the syndromes. And this one just shows here that in dogs, the most common use of antibiotics is for pruritus, scratching. In cats, the most common use is trauma and respiratory disease. I'll skip over that one, I think, for time. We can look at other species too, not just dogs and cats. This was a really interesting student project looking at a horrible disease in rabbits called fly strike. I may as well do it while I'm here, look. Called by these little flies laying eggs on rabbits, and the larvae hatch and basically eat the rabbits. It's not a nice disease. She was able to plot fly strike across the UK, look at the seasonal distribution, just as we saw with ticks. But she's also able to do some really nice epidemiology, and some of the things she found were well known, but this was not known at all. This was a completely novel finding. Because we have a lot of data, she was able to show that neutered female rabbits were 2.5 times less likely, than entire females to suffer from fly strike, and that opens all sorts of interesting questions about the biology of this disease. It's fly strike. How do we use the data? Well, as a university, of course, we want to do research, and we do, but I'm going to show you, and I've shown you some of the examples of that in the last few slides. But one of the things we're really passionate about is feeding the data back to practitioners in a way that informs them about their own local practice. So any vet that sends us data gets a secure portal or dashboard where they can see where their data comes from. They get KPIs or key performance indicators. So for example, this practice neuters 63% of its dogs, and the box and whisker here shows the averages in the or the range amongst all the other Savnet practices. So this practice is doing quite well for neutering, as an example. They can see their use of antibiotics. This practice uses a lot of PS, which is potentiated sulfonamides, and they can see all their main presenting complaints over time. So where, for example, they might be saying, I think we're seeing more gastroenteritis than we used to, or gastroenteric disease than we used to, they can go to the portal and actually see how that pattern has changed over the previous weeks and months. So that's a reward for taking part. We also produce now national surveillance reports, which we publish in the national press. We do those 3 times a year. Hard work, but we're very proud of them. I thought I'd better finish with some challenges. There are clearly barriers to data sharing. We found them in the UK, and I'm sure that will be the case in other countries too. People are going to want to know that if they're going to share their data, that they're allowed to do so and that it's ethical to share it, and that the people who are looking after it are going to use it in an ethical way. There are commercial interests to worry about. Data is worth, has value, and so people perhaps tend to want to keep onto it to maintain that value for themselves. There are issues over competition. There are issues over ownership, actually, who owns this data. And as a result of these barriers, I think what's happened is that data has stayed in silos. There's been a lack of progress, or at least slow progress at best. And I've sensed, certainly in some places, that there's a bit of disillusionment crept in around data science. People are nervous of data. What I kind of hope we can do is break down some of those barriers by at least showing in the UK. We've still got a long way to go, but we have made some progress. We encourage people as best we can to take part and to break these silos down by providing free benchmarks. I think it's really nice for a practitioner or a lab in the UK to be able to say we take part in SavsNet, and that is helping to create new evidence. It's nice for those practitioners to say to their clients that we are actually trying to help provide new data. And the other important thing to say to people with data is, you don't give up ownership of your data by sending it to someone like SavsNet. It's still your data. You can still use it. You can still get value out of it for yourself, but you're just sharing it for a bigger population view of disease. I probably would want to make the point about, in terms of breaking down this silo mentality, is it's really important wherever the data goes that it's perceived to be safe. People will ask who can be trusted with this precious data that belongs, in veterinary practices with owners and their pets. In the UK, the model that's worked very much is in a university, in our case, University of Liverpool, and I think that is a good model that can work in other countries too. Universities perhaps uniquely have a place to play in the safe use of big data like this. So to summarise on SavsNet, I think companion animals have represented somewhat of a blind spot for surveillance. Certainly in the UK, and I've seen no evidence to suggest that it's any different in any other country. And this science that we've talked about of health informatics, I think, can be a very efficient way of starting to fill that gap. Why? Because it's real time. The data is recorded in real time. We can collect it and we can now use it in real time. We can feed that data back to practitioners and also to the public, so everyone can benefit from it. We obviously have our research focus as a university, and I won't list them. I won't go through them. They're listed there. Another point I would make, which we haven't really touched on so far, is that this data has a lot to say about human health too. And we are increasingly looking for opportunities to link this data to equivalent data on humans. So, for example, around antibiotic use. I need to thank all the people in the team, but I won't go through them one by one. What's the point? There's not a huge number of them. You can do this quite efficiently with a small team, but the people who supply the data, I think, are the heroes in all this. So they're shown at the top. And also funding. We haven't talked about funding. Clearly this does cost a bit, not a huge amount. Our funding has historically come from the BSAVA, who were very generous at one stage of our development, and we're currently funded essentially by the UK government, BBSRC. Lastly, a little sense of how this has gone in the UK. It very much is a gradual process. I think it still is in the UK. It will be in the US. So I like this quote: "The elevator to success is out of order." There isn't. Actually, it's not out of order. It's just never been made. So we're doing this by going upstairs one at a time. Maybe we're a tiny bit further ahead in the UK than you are in the US, but the process is the same. And actually, maybe some of what we've learnt in the UK could speed the rate at which you go up the steps in the US. I think what you do need is motivation. You have that here, you've heard it from Laurie, and I think Laurie is a fantastic example of the motivation that comes from pet owners. Another word for that's passion. You need some people who are willing to just give it a try. A few vets, someone who writes practice management software, and a lab. That's how we started. Start small and let the snowball build up momentum as it rolls down the hill. I think an academic champion is useful. You absolutely need a strong ethical foundation because you have to use big data correctly and safely. And a good place to start is to try and fund a project coordinator. We are really keen to see what we've been doing in the UK help other people if it can. And you can be sure when you do start making those steps, well, you've started already, but you can be sure we'll support you as much as we can from across the pond. And that's it. Thank you for your time.
Yes, hi, Laurie Nicholson once again. I hope you enjoyed what Alan Radford was talking about. We will go back and do a little recap for those who are just joining us right now. But I do want to introduce and thank our state representative, Robin Comey, for coming to us today on a very snowy day. We should have had a big event, but she was kind enough to come out with some pretty slippery road conditions to be here with us and to support this program and this symposium on surveillance and companion animals. Thank you, Robin.
Thank you, Laurie. Thank you. That was very interesting, Dr. Radford.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, I love the title of this program, which is Data Saves Lives. I'm a huge advocate of having data that will inform decision making, and I am serving on the Public Health Committee as one of my committees, which is why this is so interesting, and up in Hartford. And when we talk about policy making, we do want to talk not only about what the cost will be and what the outcomes will be, but also talking about the data and proving why programs like SavesNet is great for not only dog owners, animal companion dog owners and cat owners, but also for our general health and wellness and well-being. So thanks for having me.
You're welcome. So you took quite a few notes, I noticed. You must have some questions for Alan.
I do. I'm a note taker. I was wondering, one of the things that really struck me was your text mining that you were talking about. You know, what you're doing is you're collecting all this data, and well, first of all, you mentioned that you have the differences in the UK between practitioners or diagnostic places and also vets. Can you just delineate that for me?
Yeah, I guess it's worthwhile thinking about how pet animals are treated. An owner will take their pet to a practitioner. The practitioner will create a health record on the computer in the consulting room. That's a health record in a veterinary practice. Mm-hmm. Sometimes a vet will also send a sample to a diagnostic laboratory, blood test or whatever. And the diagnostic laboratory, they're national companies. Mm-hmm. They run the tests, they send the result back to the practitioner. But there is then a health record created in the diagnostic lab. Mm-hmm. So there are two health records, one in veterinary practice, one in the diagnostic lab. At the moment, they're not very linked, but they have a huge amount of clinically useful data in them. So we collect data from both.
And you mentioned that 70 to 80%, you expect that about 70 to 80% of the laboratories are participating in your diagnostic program.
Yeah, pretty much. And we think around about 70, 80% of the vets in the UK send their samples to these laboratories.
Oh, okay.
So from the labs, we're collecting data from 70 to 80% of the vets. Mm-hmm. And direct from practitioners themselves, the health records that sit in veterinary practices, mm-hmm. around about 15% of the vets in the UK.
So you take all this information, all this data, and then you start mining it and moving it around. That's exciting for you as a scientist, right?
Yeah.
And you're working under the under a university, right? The University of Liverpool.
Yep.
Okay. And so you have a strong academic backbone. And so I was wondering, you talked about the text mining, and I really wanted to get to that. Can you tell us how you're able to get deeper into the questions that you want answered?
So text mining is really a really neat tool that ranges from incredibly simple to massively complex. But I'll give you let's try an example. So we have 5 million health records from vets in practice now. And using ticks as an example, if we want to find out which health records had animals with ticks on them, we don't ask the vet to tick a box and say if there was tick, using the word tick too often here, but we don't ask the vet to record in every consultation, tick this box if there was a tick on the animal, because that would take too long. We just use the fact that they'll write in the health record, there was a tick on this animal and we took it off. So 5 million records, we can either read them, we can't do that, there's too many of them to read. So we use in its very simplest form, we just get the computer to look for the word tick. That's the really simple text mining, but vets have spelling mistakes. The word tick is present in the word stick. As another example, we're not interested in sticks, we want ticks. They might write tock by mistake. So the next stage of complexity is building in spelling mistakes and language variation. And that's what we're doing at the moment for ticks, and that's now really very efficient. And pretty much in real time, using that method, we can plot ticks across the UK. That's called supervised because it still needs a person to come up with these terms to look for. The new ways, which we're developing with Manchester University, are called machine learning, where you essentially get the computer to come up with the search terms. And that's really exciting because it's not quite there yet as a science, but it points to a future where we can automatically get clinical meaning from the free text that vets write for all 5 million records, and that would be very exciting.
And so then you're able to say, okay, there's a tick problem in this part of the state or this part of the country.
Yeah.
And in your case, the country. And are there any, I was wondering, is there any states that are working on any of this? Any universities that are thinking about this here in the United States?
Do you want to go?
Well, yeah, Alan went out to the University of Minnesota, and I've spoken with a few people there as well. It's, from what I can gather, this is going to be kind of a complicated situation. The universities may have buy-in from the universities, but maybe not the infrastructure to get data. I mean, it's really all about the roads. If there's no roads, the information highway is a dead end, basically. And so try as they might, they still have to build infrastructure there. But I did offer that because they have a really fabulous veterinary school, that we could be a satellite to them. That we could, in the United States, Connecticut, Rhode Island, states that don't necessarily have a vet school could be a satellite to Tufts, to Cornell, to all the big, and we could feed them information and it would be safely housed there. So there's a lot of ways, there's a lot of hybrid ways we could do this, but Minnesota's the only one I know of.
You'll have to move to Minnesota, Lori.
We're moving towards that climate right now.
Yeah, it needs a researcher who has a name and a track record such that people will be prepared to share their data with them, I think.
A hub, an ethical, credentialed hub, yes.
You are blessed in the US as well because you have, and it's been here a long time, the Association of Veterinary Informatics. Remember, this science is called veterinary health informatics, and we thought we invented it in the UK, but you've got the AVI, the Association of Veterinary Informatics, in the US. Oh. So you have a bunch of people who are interested in data and what it can do for veterinary practitioners. And that's a fantastic thing that you can bring to this conversation. Do you want to mention Peter? I don't know Peter by name, but
sadly because of the weather, Peter Alberti, who's with the Association for Veterinary Informatics, was going to come down from Boston to speak. but with the weather being as it is, but there are many, many, many practitioners across the United States that believe in data, believe that it's going to lead to better health outcomes for all the pets. I would love to partner with AVI, absolutely. I'm one of their members because I'd like to know what they're feeling, what they're thinking. They're stakeholders. They're pioneers. Yeah. So they should be involved, absolutely.
They recognise the value of data. I think they've known it for as long as we have. I think there's probably some silo issues to break down, but that's fine. That can happen as a journey over time.
Yeah, one step.
Well, I
One
think,
step at a time.
yeah, I mean, you have the big players and you have the grassroots folks and the vets that are doing the work on the ground and the animal, the pet people that are really passionate about these issues like Lori and I think that if you get a good foundation and then you get the right people involved at the top level, you can braid them together and start to get some activity happening that you're coordinating your energy together and making movement on it. So I could see that being important.
We have been working on that, and then with your help, Robin, too, I hope to continue. We did contact the Connecticut Veterinary Medical Association, and there was a lot of interest from them. And like I said, it's the weather, and also the American Veterinary Medical Association. Mm-hmm. I mean, I read a paper that goes back to 1993 where the AVMA wanted to do a national surveillance for companion animals' health. Mm-hmm. And 26 years later, we still don't have it. They waited for funding from the CDC, this one, that one. It's been a moving target for 26 years. I do think, though, that having the CVMA and the AVMA involved, I mean, they are in Connecticut. They are our primary stakeholders, and these are the people with the most knowledge. And absolutely, I guess getting us all to the table is the next question. How do we do that? How do we do it?
Well, I mean, I'm willing to absolutely help. I know that we have a large group of folks up in Hartford that have started, legislators that have started an animal caucus, and that's the first time that's been started up in Hartford. So I know that they're meeting on a monthly basis or more often, and we could bring it to them and talk to them about maybe a role that they could play in supporting the work that you have in mind with the SavesNet. But we would have to develop a software program. Is that the
Yes,
big challenge?
basically.
So we need academic groups. We need a lot of
IT.
players to come to the table and to do a working group or a task force or something like that we can work on over the next year or two.
Absolutely.
How long did it take you to get off the ground?
Well, off the ground, a year. I mean, we've been
year?
going for 10 years, so we had our 10th
That's
birthday
not bad.
last year.
A year?
Yeah, but the software challenges are not huge. They're because the software is already there. Vets are using software to record this data.
Oh, I
It's
see.
just about getting the data out. So the people who write that software, they're part of the equation here. But my impression is in Connecticut, you're unique. I think you've got interest from all the people. They just need to be in the room at the same time.
Right.
And
we need to patch in their software.
yeah,
I did a
yeah.
little survey, and I called about 50 practitioners because I have no idea what practice management software they're using. And so I just started asking, and there were 3 top players that came to the top of the list every time. And so I think that, like you had mentioned, it's a matter of patching in.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So that the fixtures all fit, and then that data can flow out into a major hub.
And then you mentioned also you were on the green during the blessing of the animals, and you were asking folks questions on whether about this topic. Can you tell us what you found out?
I was actually stunned. I thought it was just me because this dog, Mr. Beebs, I mean, he went through so much, and I vowed that his suffering would never be in vain, that we could do a better job, and there should be a way to communicate. These silos don't need to exist anymore. So I started asking, actually, Alan Radford here came up with the questions, and one of them was, we have these networks in human health and for livestock and the food animals. Would you support it in companion animals? And people were like, yeah. And then they were like, what do you mean? We don't have this? And I said, sadly, we do not. And then I said, well, here's the thing. Would you consent to have your records used? Absolutely. Because people want to contribute. You know what? If it doesn't help their animal directly, they know that somehow they are doing something for the greater good all along the way. I said, would you encourage your practitioners? Yes. And I interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people at the Hartford Pet Expo, the one in Bridgeport, at Webster Arena, on the Branford Green. 100% of the time, pet owners answered yes to every single question.
That's great.
So they want what's best for their pet.
Do you have a number on how many owners opt out at the vet? Do you know
It's
it?
about 3%.
3%.
About 3%, which we're happy with. We think it's right that some people will want to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it shows the consenting process is working. But it's amazing in this day of people are nervous about sharing, and generally now when you get that chance to say, tick this box if you're happy for us to share your data, most people do not tick that box. At least in the UK, that's not. People are reluctant to share data, but your experience shows that for the right reasons.
That's right.
For the
And
right
it's
reasons.
also a story. There's a story behind it, which is like if that had existed when this dog got that multi-drug resistant bacteria, I think this outcome would have been much better. And every pet owner can relate to that. They want their veterinarian to have access to be able to say, wow, I've never encountered this before. Geez, I can start looking at textbook, or I can actually just look right now and see right in the state of Connecticut, holy cow, is this happening all the time with this one procedure? I mean, there's that information is so powerful, and it didn't exist 13 years ago, and sadly, it still doesn't.
Well, you're going to change that.
I'm trying.
Convinced, Lori.
13 years.
Your enthusiasm is absolutely infectious, absolutely. And no wonder 100% of the folks you spoke with were like, yes, I'll share my data. Well, how can people get a hold of you to get involved?
Yes, please go to www.barktobeheard.org. Send me an email. I could hook you up with both Robin and Alan for your questions. It's going to take a working group, right?
Absolutely.
It's going to take a lot of collaboration, but you know what? It is so worth it, period. It just is.
Well, I think
We've got to be doing it.
I think it's going to be a valuable tool that will help us understand animal trends, the health trends of people, and be good for our state, our country.
People can contact us at SAVSNet too. If you just Google SAVSNet, you'll find us, and you can contact us directly there as well.
Okay, so we'll put that on the screen too. SAVSNET.
SAVSNet.
Not easy to say.
Thank you. Thank you for coming across the pond.
Oh, thanks for your time. And
Thank you, Alan.
Laurie, for making it all happen.
We spoke to the what happened with my dog. We spoke to how we can make it better with a network. The one thing that I wanted to end with is why. Why these animals deserve our best effort. And so we're going to play for you a video. A lot of pet owners from right here in Connecticut, and recorded at Firehouse 12 in New Haven. But this is the why they're worth it. So I hope you take it to heart. And let's make this happen.
When I looked for love, I saw you lying by your side to take away the loneliness of love lost over time. We suffer beneath the hand as one life surely ends. Be not afraid, I'm with you into the very end. God made a dog, love made with 4 paws. God made a dog, a friend both great and small. God God made a dog. And when I looked for trust, I saw you beside the wounded man. The soldier's scarred from many now held your leash within his hands. Oh, such a tiny dog, and such a noble task to mend the wounded hearted, to make the mending last. God made a dog, love made with 4 paws. God made a dog, a friend both great and small. And all that is good, and all that is true, I found in you. I found in you a friend and a teacher, protector and a seeker, with a love so deep. You made my life so sweet. Thank God for dogs. Thank God for dogs.